there was a newspaper that came out that highlighted a lot of struggles that were going on in an Atlanta area. And I saw this young man I had never heard of before, leading struggles against police brutality, leading struggles against the Ku Klux Klan. And this was in the South. I was in California. We didn't have that many Klan we knew about out there. Going to places like Wrightsville, Georgia, where black people were being under attack. And I was thinking, wow, you know, you have people from Atlanta who were brave enough to go into these rural areas and confront white supremacists during that time. Subsequently, I would meet Michael Simanga when he would come to Los Angeles and speak to us out there. And I began to find out this brother history just didn't start in Atlanta, that he had a long history. As a teenager, Michael Simanga became very active in the movement. He was blessed to come from an activist family, and he became very active in the movement in Detroit, Michigan. He joked to me a few weeks ago, I was in Detroit, really a couple of months ago, and he said, yeah, you're really in the center of black culture and resistance. And I wanted to say something, but I couldn't. Being a historian and knowing Detroit's history, I couldn't come back. I just had to say, you're right, you got it. And Michael was a part of that history in the city of Detroit. He soon began to work with Amiri Baraka, the great ancestor, the great poet, the great writer, playwright, and activist. And so this book he's going to talk to us about, Amiri Baraka and the Congress of African People, he's extremely qualified to be able to write that history. But when we talk about Michael Simanga, he has this history with the Congress of African People. But Michael Simanga has a strong history of activism, but if you looked at Michael Simanga's complete resume, you would have had to think that this brother had about 2 or 3 different lifetimes to live. Because Michael Simanga is not only an activist, he's a tremendous writer, novelist, and political analysis, political history. But Michael Simanga, many of us also know, was the director of the National Black Arts Festival here in Atlanta and a very active person in the arts community here in Atlanta. We also know that somebody gave him a shout out, pumped up for that. And we also know that Michael Simanga has been involved in the music industry, managing the careers of Deion Ferris and Cassandra Wilson. So you're talking about a person who's multi-talented, but most of all, Michael Simanga is, and when I think about Michael Simanga, it's 2 things. One is his brilliance. Michael Simanga is a person who thinks deeply and thinks very passionately about our people's struggle, trying to figure out the ways we can move forward as a people collectively. And Michael Simanga, more than just also being a political thinker, is one who's dedicated and loves his people. So I would like for us, particularly so many people from the GSU community here, and I feel blessed to have Michael Simanga on our faculty in the Department of African American Studies. I would like us to start out by giving Brother Simanga a strong standing ovation. Let's give this freedom fighter a standing ovation. So we turn it over to Dr. Michael Simanga. Ashe.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. Dr. Umoja and I are born in the same year, as well as Dr. Akinyela in the Department of African American Studies. We were all born in 1954,
Good year.
which is a great year. And one of the watershed moments of that year was, of course, the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision declaring separate and equal unconstitutional. But I mention that because my life has been connected to this long kind of struggle of black people for our humanity my entire life. I can't remember, even as a child, my parents used to have people over to the house hotly debating the issues of the day and all kinds of, some people would say unsavory characters, but they turned out to be people who were engaged in trying to figure out how to become full human beings and full American citizens. And one of my early teachers was a Boy Scout leader. I was too young for the Boy Scouts. I was really young, I think maybe 7, 8 years old. But my older brother was a Boy Scout. And you know how it is when you're the younger sibling, you get told to go with them, or the older sibling gets to take your brother with you. Right. So I would get dragged to the Boy Scout meetings, but I was fascinated by this man. His name was Hayward Wilson. I never forget him, because he was also the field secretary for the Congress of Racial Equality in Michigan, and he was one of the principal people organizing the Freedom Rides. And so he taught me my earliest lesson of how to organize people, and that is you have to organize them where they are. So what he would do half the Boy Scout meeting would be Boy Scout stuff, and then the other half, he would talk to us about what was going on in Mississippi. And then at the end of the Boy Scouts, he would say, okay, I need you to take these to your parents and drop one, everybody's house on your block. And he would give us flyers about the Freedom Rides. And so my earliest activist activity was as a child, knocking on people's doors and saying, you need to support the Freedom Riders. I didn't even know what they were, really. I just knew that they needed to support them, right? So my whole life has been lessons like that. But it's also trying to reconcile the violence done to black people collectively and individually. I think I told Dr. Umoja once, one of the hardest things for me in life was to learn how to fight racism and white supremacy without hating white people. It's difficult, especially the experiences I had as a child where I was subjected to racist violence, and all kinds of psychological and physical attack. We had to defend ourselves. And one instance of that, or kind of a period, when I went to high school, we had moved into a predominantly white neighborhood that was turning over, so black working class families were moving out there. And when we got to the high school, that was still majority white when I got there, but when I graduated 3 years later, there were only 4 white people in my graduating class. But the teachers hated us, and they made sure that we knew it every day. That they sat us in the back of the room, they wouldn't call on us, they would give us failing grades, they would kick us out of class, anything they could do to sabotage our education. The counselors wouldn't counsel us about going out, college. They put us in special ed. Every possible way they could attack who we were and destroy our future, they did. But it backfired on them, because this is the 1960s, and the black community's power is really swelling and really feeling that power. The successes in the civil rights movement. This is around the time of the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act. And so students were highly engaged, and so we set about getting rid of all them teachers, every one of them. And it took us 3 years to do it, but we got rid of the principal, the assistant principals, and every teacher who attacked us in that school. We shut the school down. We were the first high school student takeover of a high school. We stayed in this school for 4 days. And we chained the doors, and nobody could get in, and we couldn't get in. The police had attacked us. Do you all know the great revolutionary leader Chokwe Lumumba? He was elected mayor of Jackson a few years ago, and unfortunately died second year of his term, in the first year of his term, right? Before the first year was over. Chokwe was a young law student then, and his sisters and I went to school together, and so he used to be up there all the time giving us advice on what we can do and what we shouldn't do. But what all of those experiences taught me is that what Frederick Douglass said, Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. There is no progress without struggle. That is in your personal life and in your collective life. And the power is there, though, but people get intimidated by what is perceived to be greater power, but it's not really. It just looks that way. When you study the civil rights movement, how many of you all have been in my classes in here? Oh, good. That's good to see. When you study the civil rights movement, one of the things that we learn is how ordinary people can change the world. We focus on kind of big names, Martin Luther King being the biggest of those names. But Martin Luther King was a privileged black person from Atlanta who was on the way to being, a privileged black person in his adulthood. He was highly educated. He had power. His father was a very powerful figure in Atlanta. He was associated with kind of the new wave of theological thinkers, and he could have done anything that he wanted to do. And he goes to Montgomery, not intending to stay there. He and his wife, civil rights activist Coretta Scott King, who was actually, when he met her, she was more radical than him. And we should remember that. The radical Martin Luther King was pushed forward by his wife, Coretta Scott King. That's right. But they go to Montgomery as a pass-through. This is his first pastorate, so he's doing the things that he needs to do to be a successful pastor. But then history called him. And he had to decide if he was going to answer that call or not. And what that meant was, who are you going to stand with? Are you going to go back to Atlanta and live the life of a privileged black preacher in a big church, the white establishment coming to you when there's strife to negotiate the settlement between you and the black community? Or are you going to stand with these laborers and these domestic workers? Are you going to stand with these people who dig ditches and who drive cabs? Or are you going to stand with the people who are cooking in these people's houses? Who are you going to stand with? And when he made that decision in Montgomery, he never wavered. He starts with poor working class people in Montgomery, and he is killed with sanitation workers in Memphis. And that's only 13 years between there. 13 years, from 26 to 39. So again, these lessons that I'm learning all the time, it's a question of where you stand and who you stand with. What are you willing to do? You have power. What are you going to do with that power? How are you going to deal with that? And one of the other lessons that I'm learning as the African American liberation movement is accelerating from civil rights to black power by the time I'm maturing as a teenager, is essentially this system is unworkable. It has to be changed. It cannot be reformed enough to accommodate the majority of people in this country, which is why we see today in the 21st century statistics that say 1% of the population controls 90% of the wealth. How in the world is that equitable? How is that any form of democracy? Because the 1% is able to then buy political favor, which we see now. What we see now is an absolute marriage of the 1% and government. They're not outside of government now, they are running the government. And so I'm watching all this, I'm learning this, I'm studying, and that's the other lesson that I learned, that you can't make change if you don't fill your head with information, if you don't become a thinker. It's what we talk about in class all the time. It's not reading this stuff that's important, it's thinking about it, it's giving deep thought to it, shaping ideas and figuring out new things that you can push forward to help change the conditions that we live in. And one of the great lessons is that to make change, you have to be organized. You cannot fight a highly organized enemy and be unorganized or disorganized. And it's hard. It requires sacrifice. African Americans are the most philanthropic group in the United States. Did y'all know that? We give more money to charity than any other ethnic group, but it's almost exclusively to the church. We don't give to the HBCUs, we don't give to civic organizations, we don't give to other forms of institutional development that help us resist and progress. And so one of the things that happens in this period is that people start forming organizations. Malcolm X, when he leaves the Nation of Islam, And Malcolm X is the most important intellectual influence on the Black Power movement. And he leaves the Nation of Islam and he immediately forms an organization, two of them, a religious organization, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and a political organization, the Organization of African American Unity. And during that period, people begin to organize in these kind of new formations. And when I say new, I don't mean that they had never been tried before, but their influence and their impact becomes national and even global. So we have the founding of the Black Panther Party, the Revolutionary Action Movement, and these are people that, if you don't know about them, you can look them up. The Republic of New Africa, a reference to Detroit again. The Republic of New Africa is founded in Detroit at Aretha Franklin's daddy's church, which should suggest to you that even this preacher, Reverend C.L. Franklin, who was a revered kind of preacher before his daughter became famous, but he was also a civil rights activist in the Detroit community. But he opens up his church to a black nationalist movement that is calling for an independent black state in the southern states of the United States. That meeting is held in Aretha Franklin's home church in Detroit. That's how political things are. I was actually there. It was 1968. And one of the people that I met there was the poet Amiri Baraka, who I had been following because he was so, I'd never heard poetry like that. I'd never heard anybody perform or read or even write to bend language in a way. And I love literature, poetry, art. But there was this other thing about him, and that was the high level of politics in his art. And it took me back to the Black Arts Movement, which he was one of the founders of. And the Black Arts Movement is responsible for a lot of the way we think, the way we dress, the way we wear our hair today. It was a consciousness movement that begins with an idea that the black artist has a political responsibility. There's no, in fact, the great essay called The Black Arts, written by Larry Neal, one of the founders of the Black Arts Movement, that we do not accept the notion that the artist is outside of the political movement. We don't accept this notion of arts for art's sake. If you're an artist, you have a responsibility to say something about what is going on today. We don't care that you want to, just sit around and enjoy your own art. You have to be active and do something. And this unleashes a huge movement called the Black Arts Movement, which to this day, and remember this, people are going to dispute you on this and you make them prove it, because they can't prove it. It is the most influential artistic movement in the history of the United States. It is the most influential artistic movement in the history of the United States. There's no artistic movement that has had the impact that the Black Arts Movement had. And what is the impact? It unleashed the same thing in the Chicano community, in the Native American community, in the Asian American community, amongst women, amongst young people protesting the war, that the Black consciousness movement, the Black arts movement, produces a body of work in dance, in literature, in poetry, in music, in film, in visual art, that continues to this day. Hip-hop is the child of the Black arts movement poets. And so I'm absorbing all of this, and I'm watching this cat, and I'm watching other people, and I'm going to the Black Panther headquarters for classes, political education classes, and I'm going to the Republic of New Africa. Amiri Baraka, the founder of the Republic of New Africa, one of the founders, his son was also, we were in a very volatile high school, I guess you can see. We had some other stuff there too, like y'all know the gospel group, the Winans, or the Clark sisters, they also went to the same school that I went to. So it was a hotbed of culture and politics. But I'm absorbing all these things and I'm reading all these books. And also in 1968, at my high school, they formed a Black Student Union. And a brother by the name of Jeffrey Edison, who's a human rights, civil rights lawyer, he was Chokwe Lumumba's law partner when Chokwe lived in Detroit. And they're hosting the first Malcolm X Day celebration. We used to have an annual throughout Black America recognition of Malcolm X on February 21st, the day he was assassinated. We called it Malcolm X Day. Then we shifted to start celebrating him on his birthday, May 19th. It's also the birthday of Ho Chi Minh, who led the Vietnamese struggle against Japanese, French, and American imperialism. And I'm the youngest person in the room. Used to be that for a long time, but then I became the oldest person in the room. For a long time, I was the youngest person, then that changed. I looked up one day and I was like, how old are you? And everybody had something to do. Somebody was reading poetry, somebody was doing a biography of Malcolm X, somebody was doing a dance, somebody was playing the guitar and whatever. And Jeff looked at me and he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm not doing anything, I'm just here to support. He said, well, no, you're going to give a speech about Malcolm's philosophy. It was the very first public speech I ever gave, and I've been talking about Malcolm X since then. But it also, again, that lesson, that it didn't matter that I was the youngest person in the room. I was considered an equal amongst people who were trying to make change. And that the equality meant that I also had to accept responsibility, that I had to contribute something. I couldn't just sit in the room, that I was compelled to participate, to not just be a witness, but to be a participant. And so these are shaping my ideas, and I'm looking at the various organizations. I'm active in a lot of stuff. I'm performing poetry. In fact, my career as a writer almost got derailed by two Black Arts Movement writers. One in Detroit is a great playwright named Ron Milner, who was a great mentor of mine. And Ron, during the Black Arts Movement, more than 200 black theater companies were formed in the United States. Over 100 dance companies, music companies, publishing companies. The last standing Black Arts Movement publishing company is Third World Press out of Chicago, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary of continuously publishing black works today. In fact, they published my novel. And also my wife's book, The Art of Work, Haki Madhubuti. But I went to Ron at Concept East Theater to read this manuscript of poetry I'd written. I think I was 15. Very precocious, brilliant poet, of course. And Ron, at that time, was producing, he was a traditional Black Arts Movement poet, playwright and poet, but he had had 2 plays produced on Broadway. But he spent all of his time in working class black communities teaching theater to ordinary people, young people, to workers in factories and stuff like that, and doing plays with them. He would do plays on the street. He'd write these little sketches, and you'd be walking down the street and people would bust out into a play. I mean, he'd do it in supermarkets and stuff. So he was in the tradition of the Black Arts Movement, that the art belonged to the people, it came from the people, and we must perform it and produce it amongst the people. So I go to him to read this manuscript, and during a break in rehearsal, he says, we're going to go in this room in here, and you sit down at that end of the table. And he sat down at this end of the table, and he opened my manuscript, and he was like, uh-huh. Uh-huh. It's not good enough. I was like, well, what the hell does he know? He's only Ron Milner, right? So I said, what do you mean? He said, listen, if you're going to be a writer, you have to take it seriously. You have to study it, you have to learn it, you have to work at it every day. You clearly have some talent, but talent is not enough. Everybody has talent. What you need to develop is skill and craft. So I was like, yeah, okay. I couldn't really talk back to him, he was an elder. And at the same time, I had sent that same manuscript to Haki Madhubuti in Chicago with Third World Press because I wanted them to publish me. And I got a letter that next day from Haki that said, thank you for submitting your manuscript. Yeah, it's not good enough. So I tell Haki all the time, you almost destroyed me as a writer. But it had the opposite effect. It made me work hard at it. It made me take it seriously. It wasn't just, I'm going to write some poems and I'm going to be a great poet. It made me treat it with the respect that anything of value requires. And so having involvement with the Republican of Africa, with the Black Panthers, and with other people, and at this time, I'm around 16, 17 years old, and the Black Panther Party is under deep siege by the Federal Bureau of Investigation under a program called Counterintelligence Program, or COINTELPRO. People were being killed, people were being arrested, people were being driven into exile. It was a very difficult time, not just for them, but they were a particular target, and you should read up that history. And a new organization was forming in Atlanta called the Congress of African People. And the Congress of African People emerges out of the Black Power conferences that take place in '66 in Washington, '67 in Newark, '68 in Philadelphia, and '69 in Bermuda. And the idea was to form this huge united front of black activists from all over the world, but especially the United States. And this drive to form this organization is being led by Amiri Baraka, a poet, who in 1967 at the Black Power Conference in Newark, there's a picture of him and his head is bandaged because it's 2 weeks after the rebellion in Newark, and he's brutally beaten and arrested by the police. And he attends this conference and he's leading the cultural workshop. That's in 1967. 3 years later, he's leading the politics of the black art, of the Black Power movement. Congress of African People is a Black Power organization. And that transformation comes about because he is so radicalized by what is going on, what he has experienced, that he begins to focus his art much more politically. But he understands that I can't just write poems. We've got to change the world. And so he helps to form a group in Newark called the United Brothers, which is a coalition of people. And then the Committee for Unified Newark, which brings other organizations in, including Puerto Rican organizations. And they elect the first black mayor of Newark, Ken Gibson. And that strategy then gets replicated in cities all over the country. The idea of activists, it's the first kind of black nationalist takeover of an American city, where black nationalists led the campaign to elect a new mayor, the first black mayor of Newark. His son is now the mayor of Newark, Ras Baraka. Yeah. And that was a long fight, 2 decades, you know, getting him elected to city council. He got elected deputy mayor, and eventually got elected mayor the same year that his father died, a few months later. But, so this is interesting to me because as an artist, I'm interested in the cultural work, the black arts movement. But as an activist, I'm also interested in the political work. And so the Congress of African People forms here. 3,000 to 4,000 people gather here. And one of the other influences at the time is from an activist in Los Angeles named Maulana Karinga, who creates an ideological framework that he calls Kawaida, which is a Swahili word which means tradition. And it's based upon a variety of political influences and African historical influences. And out of that comes what you all are most familiar with from this ideology is called Kwanzaa, the holiday of Kwanzaa, the 7th principle, which is the core of this ideology. And this is where Baraka had gravitated to. He was being mentored by Karinga. And in 1969, there's a huge and horrible split in the black liberation movement because Karinga's forces in a group called US Organization and the Black Panther Party have a violent confrontation on the campus of UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. And it ends with the death of 2 Black Panther members. And it sends a terrible split into the black liberation movement, where people started delineating between what they call revolutionary nationalists and cultural nationalists. And this split, it comes up even today still. People will still like ascribe to people, oh, you're on that side or you're on this side. And later, it shows our immaturity too, because later we really, when these documents are uncovered about COINTELPRO, we understand that the FBI was fostering this. The FBI was telling people to kill each other. The FBI was saying, you know what Huey Newton said about you, Karinga? Karinga, you know what Bobby Seale said about you? Bobby, you know what Karinga said about you? They said they're gonna kill you. And I mean, over and over again. You all should go online and watch The Murder of Fred Hampton. You all who are in the intro class with me, you're gonna see that in a couple of weeks, so you don't have to go online to see it. You're gonna see it in class so we can talk about it. But it is a clear state assassination where the police, through an informant, lay out a plan to assassinate Fred Hampton, the leader of the Chicago Black Panther Party, in his bed in the middle of the night. And it's clear that this is what they did. It's indisputable that this is what they did, but this is the context that we're living in, and so you have the external force of the government trying to destroy the black liberation movement. And then you have the internal conflict that is being fostered by that same government, but also by our immaturity. You have to remember, these are all young people. We're trying to figure this out while growing up. right? Martin Luther King is 26. He and Malcolm X both died at 39. They're young people. Huey Newton is 19 when the Black Panther Party is formed, right? These people are all young people. Angela Davis is in her 20s when she's hunted down by the FBI. These are young people, your age, who are in the midst of making not just reform change, but calling for substantial structural change in this country. This is one of the things, the last things that Martin Luther King said. There must be radical restructuring of American society. This is unsustainable. We cannot have these disparities in wealth. We cannot have these disparities in opportunity. And it is not just cosmetic, it is structural. It is structural. That's like saying we could reform slavery. You can't. You either have a system where people are forced to work for free or you don't. There's no in between there. Either the wealth benefits everybody or it doesn't. You cannot sit it in the middle. And so this is the moment where we're at right now. So I joined the Congress of African People. I'd started a program in Detroit called Ujima School, which is one of the principles of the 7 principles of Kwanzaa. Ujima means collective work and responsibility. There was a young Episcopal priest who became the pastor of a church that was 1 block from where the Detroit Rebellion started in 1967. And that is where we formed this school. And he was kind of a radical priest, especially to be an Episcopalian. They're pretty kind of stoic, right? And he was one of those people who inside of the church was fostering all kinds of change. And one of the changes was that they should open their doors to community groups and political activists to be able to have a place to do their work. And he caught a lot of flack for it. You know, the thing is, you got to figure out where you take your stand. Everybody doesn't have to be Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. Everybody doesn't have to be in the Panther Party or the Congress of African People. You have to figure out what it is you can do. Y'all know who Julian Bond was, the great civil rights leader, elected as a young person to the state senate in Georgia, and they wouldn't seat him because of his opposition to the Vietnam War. Had to go to court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, I think, to challenge him from his duly elected seat. Well, Julian was a very witty person. He was also a poet. A lot of people don't know that. And he has a poem in the definitive book of the Black Arts Movement. It's called Black Fire. And unbeknownst to a lot of people, because when we study these movements, we study kind of the social, political aspect of it. But civil rights and black power activists, them folks can really party. I mean, they'd be dancing and singing and drinking and all manner of stuff, just like everybody else, right? Because they're just human beings. And it was also a way to, like, deal with that incredible pressure that, you know, people were forced to face day after day where their life was literally on the line. And Julian Bond wrote a poem about this, you know, people being able to find their own place and to contribute in their own way. And the poem goes like this, a little short poem. He was at a party one night and he took notice of this sister. And he said, the poem says, "Go on, girl, and shake that thing. Everybody can't be Martin Luther King." Whatever your talent is, it's useful. But, see, y'all didn't know that about Julian, right? He's very observant. But, you know, I joined the Congress of African People in this program that we had started, which was it started as an after-school tutorial program for children in this neighborhood, which is also down the street from where Rosa Parks lived. That street was eventually named after 12th Street. It's where the rebellion started. It's called Rosa Parks Boulevard now. And it eventually grew into, and these were all young people, all high school and college students. My mother and my aunt and some other adults who were supportive of us were on our board. And out of that program came several independent schools from people who were on our board, including the school that we still run in Ghana called the Akoma Academy. But it grew from just an after-school program to after-school and Saturdays because the demand was there. It grew from just tutorial and teaching, because we taught African history and African-American history and art and culture, and we did a lot of stuff like that, to claiming land and creating a park of a vacant building, vacant lot that used to house a building that was burned down during the rebellion, and so we cleaned it up and we claimed it, we sided, and we took control of it, and the city tried to take us from us, and we didn't allow them to do it, to testing kids who were getting poisoned by lead paint that landlords use in cheap apartments because it's cheap paint, even though they know it will kill people and cause deformities in fetus and also brain damage in children. And that was one of the most interesting tests because we went and partnered with the health department. We encouraged them to come and do this. But in order for them to do it in the neighborhood we were in, because they felt unsafe, they had to do it with us, or we had to do it with them, which meant we had to go and get little kids to pee in a cup. And when you go into people's house and knock on their door and say, listen, we're here to test for lead paint poisoning, possibilities in your house and stuff. But all of these things are teaching us how to organize. We did voter registration drives. We helped elect the first black mayor. There was a police unit in Detroit called STRESS, which is an interesting acronym, right? STRESS, Stop the Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets. It was an undercover operation that in 1 year had killed 19 people, almost all of them black men. And so it was a big citywide coalition that formed to fight and to bring an end to stress. And the number one promise that we were able to get Coleman Young, who became the first black mayor elected in 1973, was that the day he was elected, he would abolish stress, and that's exactly what happened. But that comes from a demand from the people. That comes from a demand from the people being organized. So this organization then joins the Congress of African People and begin organizing with other people, other organizations like that throughout the Midwest, the East Coast, and some in the South. But most of it's concentrated there, and we have a couple of on the West Coast. And it's an interesting journey. One of the biggest projects we took on, too, in the same year. One was the African Liberation Day, the first African Liberation Day celebration in 1972. 50,000 people marched in Washington, D.C., demanding the liberation of those African countries that were still under colonialism or apartheid. It's a huge issue. 50,000 in Washington, 10,000 in San Francisco, and another 10,000 in Toronto. And it was May 25th because that was the day that the African Organization of African Unity formed in Africa, which is now called the African Union, which is an association of all of the independent states of Africa. And this came out of a brother named Owusu Sudokai, who founded Malcolm X Liberation University in North Carolina. And he had gone to Mozambique and spent some time with the Mozambique liberation fighters and Frelimo, which is an organization, the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, and saying, what can we do to support you? And he said, we've got to raise the consciousness of people in America about what is going on here, the atrocities of the Portuguese who are oppressing our people, and raise money and supplies for us to be able to fight them. And so he comes back with this idea to get all these organizations to together build this African Liberation, what became known as the African Liberation Support Committee. So all over the country, church to church, school to school, community to community, we went and talked to people what was going on in Africa. It's the same way that during this period, we spread the holiday of Kwanzaa. Kwanzaa begins with less than 30 people in a house. And by the end of the 1970s, it's millions of people. And that wasn't on TV. There was no social media. We did it house to house, school to school, church to church, community to community. And eventually, and we were teaching people about it, but also how to practice it, what the rituals were, what the symbols were, what the meaning was, connecting people to this. This was a part of our organizing methodology. And the other thing, the Congress of African People begins as this broad united front. That is the critical element that we're actually missing today. And we need to give some consideration to that. There has to be a place where all of the varying ideas and organizations and ideologies can say, on these things, we agree. So the biggest project came out of the 1970 CAP conference, and that was the call for a National Black Political Convention, which took place 2 years later in Gary, Indiana. And it was Gary was chosen because they had just elected their first black mayor, Richard Hatcher. And this conference brings 8,000 activists and elected officials and those people running for office into Gary and develops what's called the National Black Agenda. You all can go online and look it up. It's still the most progressive political document in this country, probably since the Constitution was written. And one of the things that makes this progressive is that it's focused on the issues of black people, but you can't focus on the issues of black people without changing the country. In that 1972 document, it calls for universal health care. In 1972, It calls for universal child care so that women would be freed up to go into the workforce full speed. You know, in 1972, there were less than 100 black women doctors in this country. It's a short window from there to here. But this motion of demanding change and looking at what we need, this is the work that we were doing. So we worked in education. We worked both inside of schools and reform schools, independent black schools, some of which are still surviving. Here in Atlanta, Quilombo, out in, is it Decatur? Okay. In Decatur. You all want to support an independent, culturally relevant school, you should support that school because it takes money to run a school. It also takes bodies. It also takes computers, whatever you can contribute. But you should find those kind of programs. But that's what we did. We were involved in African liberation support work, both raising money, sending material to Congress. African people had a project we called the Tanzanian Recruitment Project. We had a relationship with the progressive government of Tanzania where we recruited black people that had particular skills to go help build their nation. We had non-governmental status at the United Nations, so we were on a par with other liberation organizations. And every year we hosted a big reception of all of the African delegates and the liberation movements. We were involved in the anti-apartheid movement. We were involved in the labor movement, which is part of my own experience. When I got out of high school, I didn't go to college. I went to work. I went to work in an auto factory. And in there, we organized people, starting with a study group around the autobiography of Malcolm X. I have probably taught that book more than any book ever. And I've probably given away thousands of them. But starting a study group with people around the autobiography of Malcolm X, which led to a caucus, which led to, running people for union positions, heavily influenced by a black working class organization in Detroit called the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which starts in the factories fighting both the oppression of the white management, but also the oppression and discrimination of white-controlled unions. When I left the factory, I went back about 10 years later to work as an organizer. And myself and another brother who's deceased now from Detroit, Correga Hart, great labor organizer especially. But the night we ran candidates for an election, we had to make a deal with the gangsters to protect all of our candidates because the union, who are some real gangsters, now I mean like in the movie real gangsters, that's the mafia and stuff. And even just because they're black don't mean they're associated with them. But the parking lot is split in half and people got guns openly in the parking lot. That's how dangerous this work was because the control of a local union in a place like Detroit, like a major factory, is worth millions of dollars. And so it's not just about the political power that you get from it, but it's also, you're talking about money that these people control. So when you challenge that, Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. They push back, and sometimes they push back violently. We were also involved in political prisoner support work. At the time, who we know now as Jamil Al-Amin, formerly known as H. Rap Brown, was in prison. We did work in prisons. We went into prisons and did political education classes. Our ideology was deemed a religion. And so we used that by sending ministers into the prison to teach this political religion that we practiced. And, so our work was pretty extensive. We were also learning, and one of the things that influenced us in this middle 70s is where I am now, are the ideas of some of the great African liberation thinkers, particularly one named Amiri Cabral, from a very small country in West Africa, Guinea-Bissau, but he was a brilliant theorist and leader. He was assassinated by the Portuguese with the help of the CIA. And I say that not callously. A couple years ago, the CIA admitted publicly that they had assassinated the first elected prime minister of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba. Everybody knew it. Malcolm X talks about it. You hear him say it in several of his speeches. But they finally admitted it publicly that, yes, we did orchestrate the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. But one of the things we were noticing is more and more an attention to class struggle, to not just the national character, but how do you deal with classes and how do they align? And this led us to read kind of more classical Marxist theory. And it both helped us and it hurt us. And it hurt us because once we started making what some people call a shift to the left, it forced us in many ways to abandon the grassroots community work that we were doing. We had built up extensive networks, and people could not understand what we were saying or doing. And many of us went back into what we call point of production work, which is like factories or shipyards or steel mills or coal mines. A lot of our people went into those places to organize people. I went back into a factory and worked there for 3 years. It's how I got to Atlanta, because you know how people keep talking about they're going to revive the coal industry, don't bring back coal? That ain't happening. See, I got to Atlanta because I was a welder, and they shut the factory down to bring in robots. So I can say I'm going to bring welding back to the people, but the robot doesn't need a vacation or a bathroom break. So they ain't never going back to me welding cars. Let the robots do it. So, you know, we went into a different type of organizer, still trying to use the same methodology. But it wound up kind of bringing the era of the Congress of African Peoples' influence in the Black liberation movement. At one point, people considered it the most influential Black organization in terms of its scope. The Panthers, again, immensely influential, but they were under tremendous siege. That almost all their leadership was at one point was in prison or dead or in exile. Right. And many of their community programs had been disrupted, and just the cost of being in court all the time, which is a strategy, right? One of the great human rights, civil rights lawyers for this area is sitting in the audience, Brian Spears, who, in fact, he got me out of trouble a couple of times, didn't you, Brian? Yeah, who I've known Brian 35 years or something, and that's all he has done is stand on the side of people and lend his great knowledge of the law and his intellect to the work of keeping people free. Yeah, it's important. And I met Brian and his wife Ellen, who's a great scholar and teacher, during that period where we joined with other people who had similar ideas about class struggle, about the transformation of this country, in an organization called the League of Revolutionary Struggle, which in the American left was very unusual in that it was predominantly the convergence of 3 organizations, all radical organizations of color. Right. The Congress of African People on the Black side, Iwar Kuin, which was an Asian American organization similar to CAP or the Panthers, and the August 29th movement, which is a Chicano radical organization, formed this new organization along with white radicals, like some of these people sitting in this audience. And this was a different organization amongst the Black left. It was different than the Communist Party, it was different than the Socialist parties, because it was grounded in these struggles of people of color, and so its ideas were a little bit different than these others. But I'm saying all this to say that this journey, I was going to read from the book, but it's better to just kind of talk to you about it. You can buy the book and read it. This journey of life, if you want to have a place, a country, a community where people can live as human beings, you have to bring it about. Nobody's given that to us because there are people who believe that everybody else is here to be exploited for them. This is why the idea of slavery is so atrocious, right? The notion that other people should labor to support your lifestyle, because that's what it is. It's a lifestyle. You want to be the aristocracy of the South. You want to have power and glory. You want to have wealth and riches. And how do you do that? You have to deny these people everything in order for you to have that. The 1%, you have to deny everybody else in order to have that. That is an unsustainable relationship, which is why there's so much strife in society now. People are trying to figure out, how does this change? Well, it only changes with us. So let me say this last thing about, and then take some questions about the Black United Front. There are a lot of attempts at this, and there will be many more, but it is absolutely essential. If you look at liberation struggles all over the world, none of them succeed without the ability of a united front to confront the common oppressors. You're going to have differences. South Africa is a perfect example. You had a variety of people, the South African Communist Party, the ANC, the PAC, all different types of people, but they were in unity in opposition to apartheid. Now, what happens after that is usually a different question. But African Americans cannot forward this struggle unless we find a way to create a structure that allows us to put forth an agenda that we can work on commonly. It doesn't mean that you can't continue to do the work that you do, be the religion that you are, be in the organization that you're in, go to the church you go to. But there has to be a political agenda. And I say political agenda because politics is practical. We get caught up in the ideology of politics, but politics is practical. So back to the great African revolutionary thinker, Amiri Baraka, who said, the people are not interested in the ideas in anybody's head. They want their lives to be better. And if we remember that as we do this work, then that will guide the work that we do. What are we doing to make the life of people better? Not just espousing our ideas. Thank you.
Give him another hand. Actually, that sounds like another book. That sounds like the memoir, which will be rich. But we got to witness one of. We have the Auburn Avenue Library, but we got to witness another library this evening, which is contained in Michael Simanga. So, folks got any questions? I'm gonna start it off and then I'm gonna go up there so that I can help direct the questions. But you mentioned Black United Front. You and I talk about this all the time. What do you see, given the history, some of the, maybe one or two obstacles to developing the front, and then what are some of the solutions to kind of developing a Black United Front? And if anybody has any questions, you can line up either at that microphone or at this microphone. Come on down.
One of the things about the concept of a united front is that it is temporary, and they're both objective and subjective united fronts. So, for instance, an election is a form of an objective united front, right, where people go to vote for candidates. You may not have talked about it to this other organization, whatever, but you rally around a set of ideas or policies, and you say, okay, I'm supporting that candidate too. So that creates kind of an objective united front. A subjective united front is where people negotiate the relationship with each other. And this negotiation has to be deeply rooted in the ultimate objective. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? You asked what were some of the obstacles. The biggest obstacle is people's egos.
That's real.
And because everybody wants to be, in charge.
Right.
And everybody wants to be, today everybody wants to be in the media. Some of this work don't get done on social media. In fact, some of it doesn't even need to be discussed publicly. But you all understand what I'm saying. If you don't, you will one day. This united front has to be addressed with a certain maturity, political maturity. We have to say that we have to do this for the good of our people. That has to supersede everything else. And it's difficult. I mean, it's hard negotiating relationships with our siblings or our spouses. You in a room full of people who all think they're leaders. It's sometimes virtually impossible. But we have to find a way to do it. And the key is to get a core group of people committed to a set of principles around United Front, and then to try to build out from there. And I think that work is going on. People are trying to have those conversations, and how do we pull, as an example, did you all see the policy statement of Movement for Black Lives? The movement for Black Lives is different than Black Lives Matter. The movement for Black Lives is a united front, essentially of 50 organizations, including Black Lives Matter, but also the, what is it called, the Youth Project 100?
Yeah,
Organization of Black Struggle in St. Louis. It's a bunch of them.
100 hoodies, a million hoodies or something.
Yeah, it's a bunch of them. 50 of them came together over a year and hammered out positions on different issues. You can go online and see it. It's called the Movement for Black Lives Policy Statement. So I think it's going on in different places, and it will go on. There will be united fronts of people on the religious side. There'll be united fronts of people around electoral politics. There'll be the idea is to bring all of those into a bigger united front that says, like the Black Agenda, this is what we all agree to, and this is what we're going to fight collectively on. You can continue to do, and I think without that we get stuck. You know, we wind up like a hamster, you know, running in place. And it can happen. I've seen it happen. I've seen the impact of it. Let me give you an example. In 1972, at the National Black Political Convention, there were about 2,200 black elected officials in the entire United States. By the very next year, there were over 5,000. Because people came out of Gary, galvanized, and with methodology and ideas to organize in local communities around electoral politics. The next year after the Gary Convention, Maynard Jackson gets elected mayor of Atlanta, and Coleman Young gets elected mayor of Detroit. And both of those campaigns, and almost all of the rest of those campaigns, have a lot of grassroots community activists from various political persuasions in it. One of the problems with the progressive black community is that we help get power, but we don't hold power. See, that's why when Chokwe Lumumba, you all should, who don't know him, you should go online and see who he is. He's a great attorney who represented Tupac Shakur and Assata Shakur, and just a tremendous teacher and leader. But one of the great things about him getting elected mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, was that this meant that the most progressive sector of the black community was now going to govern a city. And what does that mean? That means that you're in charge of all of the stuff. You got to make sure the lights come on. You got to make sure the garbage gets picked up. You got to make people safe in their communities. You got to deal with economic development. It's hard, which is why we tend to pull back. We do the protest stuff, but when it comes to governing, we give that to a professional class of politicians who can give a damn about the black community. Or who get in office, and office becomes a job that they don't want to give up. You can't be in office as your job. You have to be in office as your duty. So if you're campaigning so you can employ yourself with our tax money, we don't need you there. We need people who go into office with the people's agenda and fighting for that. So progressive people have to not only help people get elected, we have to run for office, and we have to hold power, and we have to govern justly.
So I see Professor Shannon and Brother Sekou, Baba Sekou over there. She's going to yield to you, Baba.
I'm going to yield.
Thank you, Dr. Simanga.
Such politeness.
Thank you. What would you say Baraka's legacy is?
What would I say, what?
His legacy.
Oh, wow, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Amiri Baraka died 3 years ago now, right? January 9th, 2014. But a lot of the writing about him is difficult for people to kind of capture him because he had this broad influence. You know, he's one of the most influential political thinkers of contemporary times. His artistic production is hardly unmet by anybody from any place on this planet. I mean, it's a person who published 40 books. And rarely do you have a person, Langston Hughes is one of the other people they mention in the black tradition of the arts. Rarely do you have somebody who publishes in fiction. He wrote novels and short stories, poetry, drama, music criticism, and was a visual artist. And he was extremely, extremely productive. He's considered one of the great jazz critics of all time.
Yes.
His book, Blues People, is still the most important book ever written about black music. It's still, that book was published in 1960, it has never gone out of publication because it is still taught in schools, people talking about black music, because it's the first time that a black person situates black music in the struggle of black people. You can't divorce the music from the struggle of the people. It's a tremendous contribution. But I think his greatest legacy is that he chose to stand with ordinary people. He lived in a working class community in Newark,
Right.
and worked in Newark. I mean, you'd see him down at the picket line with the teachers. You know, I think that's his greatest legacy, is that he was a person of tremendous talent and intellect, and he took that and put it at the service of black people and of humanity. And I think that if any of us can do that, whatever you decide to do, if you can take whatever your talent is and put it at the service of other people, that's a legacy. Muhammad Ali says service is the rent we pay for being on this earth. There's something else I need to mention that there's a whole chapter dedicated to it in the book. One of the issues in black historiography about the Black Power movement and Civil Rights movement is the male-dominant narrative. And there's a lot of work that's been done recently and is being done about the women of the Black Liberation Movement. There's a book about the Panther women called The Revolution Has Come. Several works, and many coming. There's a lot of them that'll be out in the next year or so. But the reason this is important, and I'm saying this is because as a black nationalist organization, the Congress of African People is highly patriarchal. But that did not mean that the women were submissive. That is a misnomer about black women in the Black Liberation Movement, either the Civil Rights Movement or the Black Power aspect of the Civil Rights Movement. Black women were never passive in this process. Ella Baker was sitting in the same room at the same table as Andy Young, Jesse Jackson, Hosea Williams, James Orange, and Martin Luther King. She was in there too. No women spoke at the March on Washington. How could that be? Well, you know how it could be and why it could be. But I'm saying this to say that inside of the Congress of African People, we were always in struggle about this. And the struggle is led, the demand is led by women. And so there's a chapter in this book that says, Amiri Baraka, who's Amiri Baraka's wife for 40-something years, who was a major leader in that organization and in the movement at that time, and deserves some scholarship about her. And so I hope that some of you young people who are thinking about doing, and I hate to say that, it's just that I'm old now, so everybody's young people. That's really jacked up, too.
It's a blessing.
It is. I'm still here.
Still here.
But there's a chapter in the book called Amiri Baraka and the Women of the Congress of African People, because I wanted to make sure that people did not overlook the struggle. They fought shoulder to shoulder. There was nothing the men did that the women did not do. Shoulder to shoulder with the men on everything. Confrontations with the police, the Klan, whatever that was we were doing. Akanyele mentioned Ricefield, Georgia. We were in a long 2-year battle with the Ku Klux Klan down there, and we organized a big national march. People came from all over the country. And Sonia Sanchez says this to people whenever we're places, and she says, you know, Michael used to call me to go in the most dangerous places. I don't know why he would do that to me. You know? But I want to tell you a quick story about that, because Wrightsville is a little small town, most famous because Herschel Walker was a football player who came out of there. My friend Paul and my friend Tayana, y'all went down to Wrightsville, didn't you?
Why don't y'all raise your hand?
Yeah, some people, yes, Jomo, yeah. Jomo knows. I mean, it's a very dangerous place. People have been shot. The Klan was on the wild. Black people's voting rights were being violated and stuff. And so it's a very, you know, confrontational kind of, it's a small town. You got to go through Macon down to Dublin, and you wind up in this little town. But there was a march. We were marching down this road, and this is out in the country. So we were marching down the road to get into the city part to go to the courthouse. And it's maybe a couple hundred people, and this white dude on a pickup truck, there's an intersection, this one dirt road to this other dirt road. This white dude in his pickup truck, he stops about 100 yards back, and he's just looking, and then clearly he made a decision that I can't stand this. I'm not going to let these black people do this. And so he floors his truck, and he's driving straight at the march, like maybe 60 miles an hour within a few seconds. And there was a black GBI agent, never forget him, Lieutenant Smith. You remember this, Jomo? And he was assigned, he was always down there with us. And we knew, you know, okay, this dude is the GBI. There was some that we didn't know who they were. You know, there's always those who are revealed and those who are not. You know, like people say, oh, we don't let the police in our meeting. Yeah, they're right up in there with you. If you don't think they are, then you're making a mistake. But he drew his gun and stood in the middle of that road and aimed it at that white person driving toward us. And eventually the guy slammed on his brake and stopped a few feet. He never flinched. Lieutenant Smith never flinched. He stood there. Somebody was getting ready to get killed, him or this guy. And the guy slammed on his brake and stopped a few feet from him, at which time he snatched the door open and dragged his ass out into the ground and handcuffed him and slammed him up against the car and did a whole bunch of other stuff to him and then called for somebody to come get him. So later on that night, we were talking, and I say to him, I say, so what was going through your head in that moment? He said, well, two things. As an officer of the law, I could not allow him to do that. And as a black man, I couldn't live with myself if I had let him do it. Another lesson for me, because oftentimes we write people off because of what they do.
Right.
But we needed him in that moment, because what would have happened if he hadn't stepped in?
Right.
It was still going to be gunfire.
Right.
But the people firing would have probably wound up in prison.
That's right.
Because when I say this was a very dangerous place, I mean like both sides were heavily armed all the time. And so in that moment, and I'm not saying that to romanticize this, what I'm saying is to you is that when you're in the course of a struggle, you have to let people contribute what they can when they can. So just keep that in mind. You know, there's a lot of big moments that can be romanticized, but in the middle of that moment, it ain't very romantic, because you're thinking about what could possibly happen. And, you know, it's never, all those thoughts you have are never good. But it doesn't mean that you can retreat, because what we're going to do, let this community continue to be under siege by a group of white supremacists? No, that wasn't going to happen. I'm sorry. I'm Sekou.
Aubrey.
Thank you so much, Brother Michael. Along with the other Michaels, you know, from Martin on down. What's his name, Michael? Yeah, it was, wasn't it?
Michael Luther King.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yes. I think one of the most profound things that Amiri did for us, and I'm from New York, was to move uptown, change his name, engage us in the principles of black nationalism, that whole unfolding thing with the arts. And my question to you is this: if you know, some writers in New York, you know, some friends of mine, who were saying that Amiri was working on a biography of another revolutionary musician, Max Roach. You know, and if you know anything about that, you know, share it with us.
Well,
you know.
and actually I'll share something else with you. He was doing that, but he had also written a biography of John Coltrane that no major publisher will publish. Now, this is one of the most prominent writers in America. But again, we had Amiri here at the Hammonds House Museum a few years before he died, and one of the people in the audience said, you know, how come your plays are not on Broadway? He started laughing and said, why would they put my plays on Broadway? I'm trying to blow Broadway up. Why would they put my plays? So the same thing happened to him in publishing. There are probably, 40 more books of unpublished work of Amiri's. I mean, it's just, I was at his house last year visiting his wife, and it's just stacks and stacks of stuff that he wrote. He wrote every day, all the time, and he could write in the most, the rest of us would be distracted by stuff, and he could just shut it out and write. The poet Kalama Salam did an interview with him. Kalama Salam is a black arts movement artist out of New Orleans. And he asked Amiri, you know, you write poetry, you write drama, you write all this stuff. What would you say you are as a writer? He said, I'm a poet. He said, well, how do you know you're a poet? He said, because that's the only thing that I write every day. But this question of jazz is important because jazz is a form of resistance. It's resistance music. Why? Because jazz is created, it's a democratic form of music created by the people who needed democracy the most. Right? In jazz, you get to play the melody with the group, you're part of the community, but then you get to express yourself individually if you want to.
Right.
Only, though, if you come back to the group. So if you don't come back, you can't be in this. This is a way that we should function. You get to express yourself to be who you are, but who you are in the context of who we are. And so, and Amiri, you know, his relationship with jazz and kind of the development of forms of writing and poetry that evoke that are very important. But yeah, the books, there are a lot of us who are trying to figure out how to deal with this stuff that he left, right? You know, this huge volume. We're actually, Dr. Umoja and others talking about the same thing with Chokwe, who left, I don't know, 1,000 speeches and papers and stuff. This work has to be available to people. People have to have it. So, yeah, I'm hoping that the Max Roach and the John Coltrane biography, he was writing this a second part of an autobiography. And just so you know, Amiri Baraka never graduated from college. He went to Howard, didn't finish there. He was at Howard. He and Toni Morrison were classmates. And he did some study in New York at the New School, but then he got hired as a professor at a couple of colleges, one of them, Rutgers. And when he came up from tenure, they denied him tenure. And this is not to be offensive to anybody, but I'm going to say it in the words that he said. So the tenure committee is saying, you know, we're not going to give you tenure. And he looks at these 5 white men sitting around the table, and he says, I have published more books than all you motherfuckers together. And you going to deny me tenure? See, but that's what happens. That's what happens. Right. Here, it's not just a great African American, but he's a global artist. There's very few people in the American Academy who could equal him as a scholar and an artist. But yet, they're in a position to exercise power over him.
Right.
See, to exercise power over him. I don't know if you all know, Amiri was named the Poet Laureate of New Jersey.
Right.
And after 9/11, he wrote a poem called Somebody Blew Up America.
Right.
And it's a very controversial poem for some people. It wasn't controversial for me. But some people found it controversial. And one of the things, the theme of the poem is, you know, who are you talking about as a terrorist?
Right.
You talking about people that put black people in slavery? You talking about people who, you know, start these wars? Who are you talking about?
Blew up the church.
You got to call all the terrorists out. Right, you got to call them all out. But anyway, you can see him perform it online. There's several versions of him reading the poem, Somebody Blew Up America. But as a result of him doing that, they tried to make him resign as the Poet Laureate, and he refused to do it. And so they wound up passing legislation that abolished the position of Poet Laureate. So he goes down as the distinction as the last Poet Laureate of New Jersey. Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Dr. Simanga. I am a graduate student here. My name is Aubrey Williams. I got my BA in theater and film here. So I've been fortunate enough to have done theater since I was 11 years old. And Amiri Baraka has greatly contributed to me and what blackness means to me and how I write and how I perform, how I direct shows. So I was wondering, well, she actually already asked my question for me, but I was wondering, what would you consider to be one of the most influential works that he has written to you?
Oh. Okay, how about I give you 3?
Okay.
Okay.
I wonder if we'll match up, but go ahead.
Okay, Blues People,
Okay.
first and foremost, on black music. Almost all kind of black music scholarship goes back to that. Dutchman.
The Dutchman is definitely my top.
One-act play that is still being produced today and still has the same impact and power.
I've directed that one.
And then, and this is probably just bias, but he has a collection of poems called Wise.
Uh-huh,
W-H-Y apostrophe S, W-I-S-E,
right.
and then just the Y with an S. That really kind of demonstrates all the parts of him to me. You know, his great connection to the Pan-African world. There's a poem in tribute to Bob Marley in there and other people. His sense of music and poetry, the politics of it, and then just the sensitivity and the beauty of his writing. Oftentimes, when we focus on the content, and I talk to my class about this relationship in art between content and form, but Amiri and a lot of other people that come out of the Black arts movement, they're great artists, not just because of what they say, but how they say it. You know, that there's a sense of real, you can hear the human voice in what they say. So, you know, Amiri's writing is always has this, this beauty in it. Like there's a line in one of his poems that says, "We are the blues ourselves," right? We are the blues ourselves. Now, saying it it sounds okay, that makes sense, but when you see it in the context of the poem, it's just this very beautiful lyrical affirmation of who we are. You know, the poetry side is hard. There's a big anthology of his that was published a couple months after he died called SOS, which is from a poem that he wrote during the Black Arts Movement, SOS, calling all black people. But it comes out, the publisher, Amiri dies in January. The publisher calls this book, which he had worked on, it's a huge collection of his poetry that spans from his early years in the late 1950s in the beat movement all the way to right up before he died. But there's a collection of Black arts movement writing that Sonia Sanchez and the historian John Bracey and the historian James Smithhurst had just done working with Amiri. In fact, the book is dedicated to Amiri. That comes out at the same time, and its title is SOS, and so the major publisher calls its book SOS too, to try to, like, you know, let me capture these people that, both books are worth having. It's hard on the poetry. I think it's just so much, so much, you know.
Thank you.
Let me say this too, because about the art. Amiri Baraka at the core was a very spiritual person. At one time, we called him Imamu, which means spiritual leader. That was a title that he was given. He stopped using it in the mid-'70s, but you know, people still called him that, and his son's eulogy ends with, you know, we called you Imamu Amiri Baraka, because his search politically and artistically was always for how do we as human beings capture that right spirit? What is that? And so he, like a lot of people in the Black liberation movement, particularly influenced by Malcolm X, he investigated Islam. You know, he was raised in the Christian church. He studied traditional African religions. He's a widely read person. I mean, he read all the time. And part of our relationship, whenever I would see him, he would always give me a book. You read this? You need to read this. You read this? And then he would call me, you know, you read that book? You just gave it to me an hour ago. You know? But it was not just, you know, political theory. It was a lot of stuff. It was philosophy. It was about art. It was theological stuff, you know. And I think that any true kind of revolutionary person is really trying to create the physical environment for greater spiritual life. See, the problem is that institutionally, the institutions of spiritual life tend to become oppressive and self-perpetuating. And it becomes about power, who's at the top of it, who's in charge of it. You know, there's a great struggle in the Catholic Church right now over this Pope who comes out of the liberation theologists of South America, right? And the traditional Catholic hierarchy, and they're like, wait a minute, this dude's talking about we got to do what for poor people? You know, but that's the struggle. It's like, how do you change the world so that we can live as human beings and be our best selves, our most conscious selves? And that includes stuff like stop going to war with each other. You know, stop abusing each other, stop oppressing women, stop committing violence against children, stop destroying the planet. All of this requires a higher consciousness. And Baraka was very much about that. He was very much about trying to find a way to transform this world so that we can live as human beings where we live in a humane and just society.
I guess that brings me to another question.
Oh,
Oh, sorry.
no, you got
No?
to
Okay.
get in line and buy your book, and then you're going to ask that question. We're going to, the brother here, and these two questions here will be our last two.
And I'll try to give shorter answers.
So we can, because some of us here want to buy the book.
And some of us here want you to buy the book.
Yeah, I know that's right. So, brother Rich, you're next.
How you doing, Dr. Simanga? Quick question. One of my favorite Amiri Baraka poems was a poem called Dope. I know you probably heard of that one. My question is, what was the whole backdrop or story behind him making the poem Dope?
You all know this poem? The poem goes, woo, 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 must be the devil. Woo, 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 must be the devil. Can't be the police, it must be the devil. Woo, 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 can't be the capitalists, it must be the devil. So it's like that, right? So the idea of dope is anesthetizing people. And dope in oppressed communities, all over the world, historically, people in power have used dope as a way to control people. So his poem is talking about not the dope you inject in your veins or snort up your nose. He's talking about the dope of ideas. He's talking about the dope that's put out there to keep you from doing your work, to keep you from living the life you want to live. So we start chasing things. Like right now, my brilliant, beautiful daughter is out there selling books. And every time a new iPhone comes out, I got to have that. Well, what's wrong with your phone? Nothing. Just not the new one, right? But that's the culture we live in.
Right.
We live in a culture where we chase things. And so this is what the poem is talking about. It's talking about people who are subjected to this, and it's all kinds of dope. We got a dope dealer in the White House, who's selling stuff to people every day. People walking around in the haze, high, thinking, oh, this is great. Meanwhile, their stuff is being taken away from them. Some of them are waking up. That's why they rowdy at these hearings about their health care. They go, wait a minute. I didn't think Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act were the same thing. That shows you the great public school system we have, right? the impact of that. Thank you, brother.
Hello. So I guess from what I've learned so far is that radicalism, as well as having a highly structured organizing committee, is what are going to be most effective in terms of dismantling the supremacy. But do you think there are other strategies that could prove to be just as effective?
I don't know if they can be just as effective. I think ultimately, historically, and things change, but the history of the world is that the people who are the most organized tend to win, and the people who are most committed tend to win. And that becomes the question. So if you take something like the Congo or Kenya, where let's take Britain. This is a little small island off the coast of Europe, right? Northern Europe. It's a little small island that at one time was the most powerful empire in the world. In the world. In fact, they used to say the sun never sets on the British Empire. If it's night in this part of the empire, it's day in that part of the empire. And all of this was the British Empire. The American colonies, the Caribbean, Canada, with the exception of the small footholds of Spain and France. All of this was part of and Portugal further down. So history tells us that the people who are most committed and most organized will eventually win. It also tells us, though, that the forms of organization have to be constructed to the moment, right? Moment meaning the time. What might have worked yesterday and someplace else, it's time and place, might not work here. And so the strategy really has to be, how do we organize ourselves here today? The strategy has to emanate out of that. We can learn lessons from other people, But ultimately, it's a lot of stuff. Y'all know Bishop Desmond Tutu? Bishop Tutu is an Anglican, which is the English form of the Catholic Church. He's a bishop in South Africa who's a huge leader in the anti-apartheid movement. But he was not on the same page with a lot of stuff of Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela. He didn't agree with them on some stuff. But I'm saying it to say that ultimately, when you call it a movement, it gets to a point where there's movement in a lot of different sectors that are not necessarily subjectively connected, but that people are pushing stuff forward along that same line in other ways, you know. And it could be simple stuff. A study group that starts to read certain political ideas and discuss them and then goes out and does projects. Right now, there's going to be a great need for people to work with young people around education because the public education system is on the verge of collapse. And so what's going to happen to all of those children? How are they going to learn to read and write and do arithmetic and science and the rest of the stuff? We have to figure out that cannot rely upon other people to do it. And, you know, we have to think about these things. So I'm saying that to say that the strategies, it will become clearer as we do the work and as we study. This, the two things, I kind of didn't mention this, but throughout this period, our framework for doing the work we did was work and study. Work and study. They were never divorced. You couldn't, in fact, people would talk bad about you if you got caught without a book. Because as we're doing this work, you gotta study stuff to figure it out. You gotta learn, and you gotta learn from other people, but you also have to learn from your own history. So I think we're in a moment now, a lot of young people, Dr. Umoja and I talk about this all the time, we're very inspired. You know, this is a new generation. Think about Michael Brown gets killed fall of 2014, is that right? 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And so there are a lot of young people, Trayvon, Sandra Bland, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, all these people, all of these incidents also gave rise to a group of young people who've learned how to organize. And they have now 2 or 3 years worth of experience in certain forms of organization. And they're gonna get better and they're gonna learn more. But it's critical, and this is we're in a unique moment too, because there are literally thousands of veteran organizers all over this country. All over this country. Dr. Moji mentioned meeting me when I was a teenager. I met him when he was young. He was doing the same thing. He was out in Los Angeles organizing people. So, but you grow into it. You develop, and that's what's happening right now. So we're very inspired, but it's important for the connection between the generations. You all have work in your generation to do that we can help guide you. We can't do it. Y'all have to do it. But we're there. We're here, you know, and you don't even have to listen to us. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. You don't have to do what we tell you, but you do need to listen to us. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I agree.
You do need to listen to us because you need to gain the experience and knowledge that we have. But you still have to go do it yourself. And you're going to create new forms of organization. But let me just say this. Right now, in this period, people need to be thinking about more sophisticated forms of organization.
Teach.
Because it's about to get sticky.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, we have our last question.
Hi, good evening. If you could speak to my concerns, and you mentioned the organizing, I wanted to ask how close or have you been able to identify the demographics of the 1%? And then if you have, how are you able to work towards the solution without hating those individuals who are inflicting the minority groups with these, burdens?
Let me answer the second part first. What I grow to understand is that hate is a useless emotion. If you're trying to move forward, if you're trying to stay where you are or move backward, then fill yourself with that, because it is a negative and violent emotion. It is an emotion that causes us to do harm to people. One of the great spiritual lessons I think that all of the sacred texts talk about, almost universally, all over the world, and even those that are not written. You know, as a historian, they teach you historiography is the study of history, but it's really not. It's the study of history that's written. It's the study of the writing about history. So, which is why people call people prehistoric, before history. You can't even be before history.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That don't even make sense.
Right. Teach.
Right? That's not, it's nonsensical.
Right.
Or those people were here before history was made.
Right.
But what they're saying is that their history does not matter
Right.
because it's not what we consider to be history of civilization.
Teach.
So these ideas we hold on to that take us back to things that take us away from the spiritual nature of ourselves as being. We're not just flesh and bone. We're not just, you know, ideas and thought. We're not just electricity swirling around in our head, which is why we're always trying to figure this out. Hate keeps us from that. Hate keeps us from getting to that other thing. So when we design change in society, if we're filled with hate, then the changes we make perpetuate what we're fighting against, actually. We become the instrument of that. And so, and I don't always love everybody. I try, but I try not to hate them. But this 1% is a class issue. But more than a class issue, it is a power issue. And power has to be transferred from people who have power now, who oppress us, into the hands of the people. And it's done incrementally. This is why we made a mistake in this election. See, people were going around saying it doesn't make a difference who's the president. Absolutely it makes a difference. You all see that now, right? Because the policies have a real life effect on people. So last week, a reversal of a Obama trend executive order, the Clean Water Act, which prevents mining companies from dumping the toxicity that comes out of mining into the water of the communities around the mine. Now, who in their right mind would think that it's okay to do that? Well, people who say, I ain't got to live down there with them poor white people. I don't drink that water. Back that truck up there and dump it in that stream. See what I'm saying? It's a power issue. So in an election, we have to evaluate people. And we have to say, okay, this is not what I want, but this is more toward the ideas that I have, and it's up to me to push those ideas forward. It's not up to Obama. Obama's the president of the American empire. If you had any expectation that he was going to be the president of something else, then you were immature. He's the president of the American empire, but that class is not all the same. They're not the same people. There's a right, there's a left, there's a center. Obama would be center almost left, right? Bernie Sanders would be center further left. And had Bernie Sanders run as an independent, he might be the president right now. See, there would have been a legitimate third-party alternative. So my point, I always go long on this stuff. See, this is what happens when you read all these damn books. You got too much stuff up there.
It ain't all books, though.
But this issue of the 1%, they have taken control, absolute control of the government right now. This is what this election, politics is both offensive and defensive. The Hillary Clinton campaign for us was a defensive measure. It was not an offensive measure. Bernie Sanders was an offensive measure, but it was a campaign that was not positioned correctly. I have no idea why he ran as a Democrat. His whole life has been as an independent. Had he run as an independent, it would have galvanized the independent movement, as it did. But then people were left with no place to go because people don't really see the Libertarian Party and the Green Party as legitimate, alternatives to the Democrat or Republican Party. So, but that's a lesson we learn. We have to take power every step that we can. It's a community, in a school, a city council seat, at your job. That's why unions exist, to transfer power from the owners, from the bosses, to the workers, right? That's why women's organizations existed, to take power away from just men deciding. Did y'all see that picture of them signing this act about reproductive rights for women? It was all old white men in the White House All old white men talking about what women can do with their bodies. So it's every place you can, you want to take power and bring it back to the people. Here in this school, the African American Studies Department starts from students saying, we want an African American Studies. That's the tradition of African American Studies.
That's right.
It begins with a demand in San Francisco State that black people are not included in higher education, in the education system of America. Are we included now? I have students all the time telling me in their U.S. history class, they don't even talk about black people, as if slavery was not the economic foundation of American society. You can't even talk about America without talking about black people. You have to talk about it. You have to talk about it. The Tilden-Hayes Compromise, which brings a halt to Reconstruction. We would be sitting in a different South right now. The Reconstruction governments was poor white people, newly freed black people, building democracy, free public education, electing people who weren't rich to office. We'd be in a different South right now. How can you not teach that in American history? How can you not say something about that? So we have to take that back. We have to make that demand. Students have to demand that the African American Studies program not only exist,
Teach.
but that it is supported and expands.
That's right. That's right.
But you all have to make that demand. You have to say, we want more African American studies. We want more African American studies professors. We want more women's studies. We want more Chicano studies. You all have to say that. If you don't say it, remember Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. Thank you all for coming tonight.